Before you hear my story, I want you to picture a garden, not a prim, perfect little flower bed, but a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful wilderness of a place. A place with ancient rose bushes, whose thorns are as sharp as needles, and weeping willows that droop so low their branches kiss the ground. For 20 years, that garden was my world. It was my home, my prison, and ultimately my salvation. My name is Alice, and this is the story of how my own family tried to prune me from my life, not realizing I was the root of the entire tree. It started, as these things so often do, with a death. My father, Arthur, was a man who seemed to be carved from the same ancient oak trees that dotted our estate. He was solid, quiet, and deeply rooted in the land he loved. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a house to him, it was a living thing, an entity that he tended with as much care as he tended his own daughter. He was my whole world, and I was his. When he died suddenly from a heart attack, the world didn't just go gray, it felt like the soil itself had lost its nutrients. I was 18, just old enough to feel the full crushing weight of the loss, but too young to know how to navigate the world without his guidance. His wife, my mother Helen, grieved in a very different way. Her grief was loud, public, and performative. She wore black for a year, but it was always the most expensive, fashionable black. Her sorrow was a cloak she wore to garden parties and charity luncheons. And clinging to her arm was Roger, my father's business partner, a man with a smile as slick as oil on water. He had always been a presence in our lives, a necessary annoyance, but in the wake of my father's death, he became a fixture. His condolences were too smooth, his hand on my mother's back too familiar. 6 months after the funeral, he moved in. A year after that, he was my stepfather. They presented my father's will with a somber flourish. It was, their lawyer explained, very straightforward. Helen, as his surviving spouse, would be the primary beneficiary and executrix of the estate. I was to be provided for with a generous living allowance until the age of 25, at which point a modest trust fund would become available. It seemed wrong. My father and I had talked endlessly about my future, about me taking over the management of the estate one day. But I was numb with grief, and they were my parents. I trusted them. That was my first mistake. The generous living allowance turned out to be just enough to cover my basic needs, and most importantly, the upkeep of the gardens. Roger explained it to me with patronizing gentleness. "Alice," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder feeling more like a weight than a comfort, "your father would have wanted the gardens looked after. It's your connection to him. We'll handle the boring financial stuff. You just focus on the roses." And so my role was set. I was the keeper of my father's memory, a living tribute confined to the grounds of my own home. I became, for all intents and purposes, the family gardener. While I spent my days with dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my brow, my mother and Roger lived lavishly. They sold off my father's art collection to diversify the portfolio. They replaced his sturdy, comfortable furniture with minimalist glass and chrome monstrosities that were cold to the touch. They hosted extravagant parties where guests would compliment the stunning gardens, and my mother would graciously accept the praise as if she'd planted every flower herself. I was rarely invited. If I was, it was to be trotted out as the sentimental daughter with the green thumb, a quaint little curiosity before I was expected to fade back into the foliage. Then there was Chloe, Roger's daughter, my stepsister. She was a year younger than me, and was everything I was not: polished, loud, and supremely confident. She floated through life on a cloud of her parents' money and my father's legacy. While I was given an allowance that barely covered fertilizer and new trowels, Chloe was given sports cars for her birthday and a fully funded gap year that seemed to stretch into a half-decade of resort hopping. She was the golden child, and I was the gray, drab backdrop that made her shine all the brighter. For years I accepted this reality. I told myself I was honoring my father. I found solace in the earth, in the predictable cycle of bloom and decay. The gardens were my sanctuary, the only place where I didn't feel like an intruder in my own life. It wasn't about the money. I convinced myself, it was about the respect for his memory. The end of that delusion came on a warm Tuesday evening in June. Roger and Helen had called a family dinner, something that happened so rarely, it immediately set my teeth on edge. I sat at the enormous dining table, my hands scrubbed clean but still feeling out of place on the polished wood. Chloe was there, glowing, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Roger cleared his throat, tapping his wine glass with a fork. As you all know, he began, beaming at Chloe, our brilliant daughter has decided to enter the world of public service. She's running for a seat on the city council. My mother clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pride. It's a noble calling, but campaigns, as you know, are terribly expensive. We need to give her the best possible start. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. I knew what was coming. So Roger continued, his voice booming with false magnanimity. Your mother and I have made a decision. We've received a fantastic offer on Blackwood Manor. We're selling the estate. The words hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Selling it. Selling my home, my father's home, the land, the gardens, everything. I couldn't speak. My throat closed up, a knot of pure cold shock. Chloe reached across the table and patted my hand. Her touch was condescending. Oh, don't look so sad, Alice. It's for a good cause. Think of all the people I'll be able to help. But it was my mother's next words that truly broke me. She smiled, a kind, placid smile that didn't reach her eyes. And don't you worry about a thing, darling. We've already spoken to the new owners. They're a lovely development corporation. They were so impressed with the grounds that we've arranged for you to stay on. They're looking for a full-time gardener, stay on, as hired help, in my own home. They weren't just selling the house, they were selling me with it, a quaint garden gnome to be included in the purchase price. They saw no difference between me and the prize-winning dahlias. We were both just living assets of the estate. The irony of that phrase would not hit me until later. In that moment, all I felt was the ground giving way beneath me, a final, brutal severance from the last piece of my father I had left. They had finally succeeded in pruning me completely. I don't remember leaving the table. I don't remember the walk across the manicured lawn, past the fountain my father had installed, the one whose gentle burble had always sounded like laughter to me. All I knew was a desperate primal need to get to the one place on the entire estate that still felt like mine, the old potting shed. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth, peat moss, and something else, the faint, lingering smell of my father's pipe tobacco, a ghost of a scent that had somehow clung to the old wooden beams for a decade. This shed was my true sanctuary. It was cluttered and chaotic, filled with stacks of terracotta pots, half-empty bags of soil, and tools worn smooth by my father's hands and then my own. It was a place of work, of life and death for seedlings, and it was the only room in the entire manor that Roger and Helen had never bothered to renovate or update. It was beneath their notice. I sank onto a rickety wooden stool, the shock from the dining room finally giving way to a tidal wave of grief, so profound it felt like I was drowning. The tears came then, hot and silent. It wasn't just about the house, it was the absolute crushing finality of it. They hadn't just disinherited me from the property, they had disinherited me from my own family, from my own history. The offer to let me stay on as the gardener wasn't an act of kindness, it was an act of ultimate psychological cruelty, a way to keep me in my place, forever tending their memory of a life I was never allowed to be a part of. It was a statement, you belong in the dirt. My mind started to spiral, replaying a decade of slights, a highlight reel of my own erasure. I saw myself at 16, standing beside my father at the edge of the sprawling rose garden he had designed. He had pointed to a particularly stubborn, gnarled bush. This one's an heirloom, Allie, he'd said, his voice warm and rumbling. It doesn't look like much next to the fancy new hybrids, but its roots go deep. It survives the harshest winters. It's a survivor. He had looked at me then, a serious expression on his face. This place, this land, it's in your blood. It will always be yours. The land remembers who cares for it. His words meant to be a promise, now felt like a curse, a bitter irony that tasted like ash in my mouth. Then another memory surfaced, sharper and colder. A few years after he died, Chloe had decided she wanted to be a social media influencer for a week. She dragged one of her friends into the prize-winning dahlia patch, the one I spent hundreds of hours tending, the one that had won my father a blue ribbon at the county fair. They'd trampled the delicate blooms, snapping stems to create the perfect cottagecore backdrop for their photos. When I'd confronted her, my voice shaking with rage, she had just laughed. Oh, relax, Alice, they're just flowers. Daddy will buy you more. I had gone to my mother, holding a crushed, decapitated dahlia in my hand. Helen had simply sighed, an expression of pure exhaustion on her face. Alice, please don't make a scene. Chloe was just having fun. You're being far too sensitive. I was punished for the broken flowers with a lecture on my attitude, while Chloe was praised for her creative eye. It wasn't a single event, it was a slow, steady erosion of my sense of self-worth. They had perfected the art of making me feel small, of framing their neglect as my own personal failing. I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too attached to the past. They were the forward-thinking ones, the practical ones, while I was just the strange soil-stained girl who talked to plants. My passivity, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, had been a choice. I had chosen to believe in the fantasy of honoring my father. I'd clung to the idea that if I just kept my head down and worked hard, if I made the gardens beautiful enough, they would have to see me. They would have to acknowledge my worth. But they never did. They just saw a well-tended asset that increased the property value. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and a guttural sob escaped my lips. I lashed out, not in a conscious act, but in a spasm of pure blind pain. My arm swept across a dusty shelf, sending a cascade of old, empty clay pots crashing to the floor. They shattered, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the small space. I stared at the terracotta shards, my breath catching in my throat. And then I saw it. Tucked away in the dark, cobweb-filled space, behind where the pots had been stacked for decades, was a book. It wasn't a book I had ever seen before. It was thick and bound in dark green leather, cracked and faded with age. There was no title on the spine. It looked ancient, forgotten. My curiosity, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness of my despair, was piqued. I reached back, my fingers brushing away a thick layer of dust, and pulled it out. On the cover, embossed in faint, peeling gold leaf, were the words Blackwood Manor, Gardener's Ledger, 1985 to 2012. It was the logbook of Elias Vance, the head gardener, who had retired the year before my father passed away. My heart ached. Elias had been a kind, gnarled man who had taught me how to tell the difference between a weed and a wild flower. I opened the ledger carefully, the old leather creaking in protest. The pages were filled with Elias's spidery, elegant script, detailing planting schedules, soil pH levels, and notes on frost dates. It was a history of the garden, a secret diary of the land itself. I smiled faintly, a genuine smile for the first time that day, tracing his notes about the heirloom rose my father had loved so much. I flipped through the pages, lost in the memories, a quiet tribute to two men I had adored. I was about to close it when I noticed something odd. The last few pages were different. The handwriting changed. It was bolder, more familiar, a masculine scrawl that I would recognize anywhere. It was my father's handwriting. My breath hitched. He must have used the back of the ledger for his own notes after Elias left. The first few entries were what I expected. Ideas for a new water feature, a list of Japanese maple varieties he wanted to plant. But the last entry, dated just 2 months before he died, was different. It wasn't a note. It was formal, structured, and written with a heavy, deliberate pressure on the pen. It was titled, Addendum to My Last Will and Testament. My blood ran cold. I read the first line, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. This document, being of sound mind and body, serves as a legally binding codicil to any and all previous wills executed by me, Arthur Gable. I scanned the page, my eyes devouring the words. He wrote about his love for the manor, for the land itself. He wrote about his growing concerns, his fear that his vision for the estate would be lost, that its soul would be sold off for profit by those who saw it only as a number on a balance sheet. He didn't mention Roger or my mother by name, but he didn't have to. The meaning was crystal clear, and then I saw it, the final operative clause, the sentence that changed everything. Therefore, in the event of my death, I hereby amend my bequests, while my wife Helen Gable shall retain access to my liquid financial assets and investments for her lifetime, the ownership of the physical property, known as Blackwood Manor, located at 1450 Old Mill Road, including all structures, land, and all its living assets, both flora and fauna, shall pass directly and irrevocably to my beloved daughter, Alice Gable. Beneath his signature were 2 other signatures, under the heading Witnessed by. The first was Elias Vance. The second was a name I recognized as his old fishing buddy, a man who had moved to Florida years ago. The ledger slipped from my numb fingers and fell into my lap. The land and all its living assets, The very words Roger and Helen had used to diminish me, to categorize me, alongside the plants I tended, my father had used them to empower me, to save me. He had known, somehow, he had known what they were capable of. He had seen the rot setting in long before I had. He hadn't just left me a note, he had left me a weapon. A quiet, hidden, ironclad declaration of his love and his faith in me. The tears that came now were not tears of grief. They were tears of rage, of vindication, of a love so fierce and protective it had reached across the gulf of death to find me. The despair that had hollowed me out just moments before was gone, burned away by a white-hot fire. It was replaced by something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. A single crystalline thought formed in my mind. They were not going to sell my home. They were not going to fund their perfect daughter's future with my birthright. They had made one critical, fatal mistake. They had spent a decade looking at me and seeing only the gardener. They never ever thought to look inside the gardener's ledger. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about taking back what was mine. I stood up, my back straight, and carefully picked up the ledger. I wiped the dust from the cover, holding it to my chest like a shield. I walked out of the potting shed and back into the fading evening light. The garden no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a kingdom, and I was its queen. The first rule of gardening is patience. You don't plant a seed and expect a tree the next day. You nurture it, you protect it, and you wait for the right conditions to let it grow. For the first time in my life, I understood that this applied to more than just plants. My immediate primal urge was to storm back into that cold, sterile dining room, to slam the ledger down on the table, and watch the smug looks on their faces curdle into panic. But some new cold instinct held me back. For 10 years I had been predictable. I had been emotional, earnest, and easy to dismiss. They knew how to handle that Alice. They had no idea how to handle the one who was now looking back at her own reflection in the dark windows of the living room. My greatest weakness had always been my transparency. My heart was always on my sleeve, ready to be bruised. My new strength, I decided in that moment, had to be their ignorance. They had handed me the script for my own demise, and now I would play the part. I would be the heartbroken, defeated daughter. I would let them think they had won. I went back to my small room in the attic, the maid's quarters from a bygone era that they'd graciously allowed me to keep. I carefully wrapped the ledger in an old oilcloth and tucked it deep inside a hollowed-out book on my shelf, a dusty copy of The Secret Garden. The irony was not lost on me. Then, I composed myself, splashed cold water on my face to make the tear stains look authentic, and went downstairs. They were in the living room, sipping brandy, celebrating their victory. Helen looked up as I entered, her expression a careful mixture of pity and impatience. "Alice, darling, are you feeling better?" I kept my eyes downcast. "I just needed some air," I mumbled, my voice intentionally small and shaky. "It was just a shock. I understand, it's for Chloe." Roger swirled his brandy, the picture of magnanimous leadership. "That's the spirit. It's for the good of the family. We're all making sacrifices." The sheer audacity of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. The only sacrifice he'd ever made was trading up from his modest condo to my father's mansion. I just nodded, a meek little bob of the head. "The new owners, did you say they'd need me right away?" I asked, hating the taste of the words in my mouth, but knowing it was the perfect line. It was exactly what the weak, pathetic Alice would say. Relief washed over their faces. It was visible. I was folding. I was accepting my fate. "We'll make sure it's all in the contract, Alice," Helen said soothingly. "Your position will be secure." I retreated back to my room, their patronizing reassurances echoing in my ears. The performance had been a success. They were comfortable. They were complacent. And complacent people make mistakes. The next morning, I called in sick to my job in the garden. I told them I was too distraught to work. They were understanding, even encouraging me to take a few days. It gave me the opening I needed. I took the bus into the city, the precious ledger wrapped securely in a tote bag on my lap. I had an appointment to keep. I hadn't seen Mr. Albright in years, not since the original reading of the will. He had been my father's lawyer and friend for over 30 years, a sharp, kind man, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. After my father's death, Helen and Roger had quickly moved the estate's business to a flashier, more expensive law firm, one that was better suited to their modern needs. They dismissed Mr. Albright as a relic of the past, just like they dismissed me. His office was in an old, respectable brick building, the kind with a real wooden door and a brass nameplate. It smelled of old paper and justice. He greeted me with a warm, sad smile. "Alice, it's been too long. I was so sorry to hear about, well, everything." He led me into his office, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling. We made small talk for a few minutes, but my nerves were frayed thin. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I took the ledger out of my bag and placed it on his large mahogany desk. "Mr. Albright," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I think you need to see this." He looked at the ledger with curiosity, then opened it to the page I had marked. He put on his reading glasses and began to read. I watched his face. For a long moment, there was nothing but intense concentration. Then, his eyebrows shot up. He read the passage again, his finger tracing my father's signature. He took off his glasses and stared at the page, then at me, then back at the page. A low whistle escaped his lips. "Good heavens," he whispered. He looked up at me, and the sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, steely glint. "Alice, do you have any idea what this is?" "I think so," I said. "But I need you to tell me if it's real, if it's legal." He spent the next hour examining it, holding it up to the light, studying the signatures, the paper, the ink. "The witnessing is correct," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Elias Vance, I remember him, honest as the day is long. And John Peterson, yes, he moved to Naples. We can find him." Arthur used a specific notary for all his personal documents, a woman named Carol. "We need to see if her stamp is on here." He flipped the page over, and there it was, a faint but clear embossed seal, and a signature. "There. It's real, Alice. It's a perfectly executed codicil." He leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Your father was a clever man. He was also a worried man. In his last year, he told me he had concerns. He felt a chill in his own home. He never specified, but I had my suspicions about Roger. A man who flies too close to the sun always wants to steal its warmth. This was the validation I didn't know I needed. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being too sensitive. My father had seen it too. "So what does it mean?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "It means," he said, tapping the ledger with his finger, "that your mother and Roger have been acting as executors of an estate they have no legal authority over, based on a will that was superseded by this document. It means the house, the land, everything on it, it's yours. It has been yours since the day your father died." I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding for a decade. "Now," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the easy thing to do would be to file this with the probate court immediately. We'd send them a cease and desist, stop the sale, and have them out of the house by the end of the month." He paused, a glint in his eye. "But where's the justice in that?" This was the moment my quest for what was mine began to tilt into something else. It wasn't about revenge until it was. "What do you mean?" I asked. "For 10 years, Alice, they have lived off your inheritance. They have committed what we lawyers call a breach of fiduciary duty on a grand scale. They've sold assets, spent income, and treated the estate like their personal piggy bank. If we just take the house back, they walk away with a decade of ill-gotten gains. But if we let them continue down this path, if we let them finalize the sale of a property they do not own," I saw it then, the beautiful, terrible trap. "They'd be committing fraud," I whispered. "Massive, multi-million-dollar fraud," he corrected me with a satisfied nod. "They'd be in breach of contract with the buyers, they'd have to return deposits, pay penalties, and Chloe's campaign, which they are so publicly funding with the proceeds of this fraudulent sale, it would implode. The political and social humiliation would be significant." He laid out the plan. It was simple, elegant, and ruthless. We would do nothing. We would let them proceed. We would let them book the movers, sign the final contracts, and make their grand public announcements. He would quietly begin gathering evidence on the back end, a full accounting of the estate's finances since my father's death. He would track down the witnesses. We would build an ironclad case, not just for the ownership of the property, but for the recovery of every single dollar they had squandered. "But it requires you to do the hardest thing imaginable," he warned me, his expression serious. "You have to go back there and continue to play the part of the victim. You have to watch them pack up your father's legacy and smile. Can you do that?" I thought of my mother's pitying gaze. I thought of Roger's smug pronouncements. I thought of Chloe suggesting I could work for the strangers who bought my home. I looked at Mr. Albright, the cold resolve I'd felt in the potting shed now forged into something unbreakable. "Mr. Albright," I said, "I've been rehearsing for this role my whole life. I think I can manage." He agreed to take the case on contingency, his fee to be paid from any funds we recovered from Roger and Helen. "Consider it a professional courtesy," he'd said with a wink, "for Arthur." My lawyer wasn't just an ally, he was an avenger, a friend determined to see his own friend's true wishes honored. It was a powerful alliance, forged in secrecy and fueled by a shared sense of righteous indignation. We were no longer just reclaiming an inheritance, we were orchestrating a reckoning. The next few weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare, with me as the sole silent combatant. I went back to my duties in the garden, my head bowed, my demeanor one of quiet resignation. The for sale sign went up at the end of the long tree-lined driveway. It felt like a stake being driven through the heart of my childhood, but I learned to look past it, to focus on the weeding at my feet, on the steady rhythm of my work. My apparent submission made them careless. They spoke freely around me, convinced I was a non-entity, just part of the scenery. "The buyers are so eager," Helen would say on the phone, her voice drifting out from the open kitchen window as I deadheaded roses. "They want a quick closing." Apparently they planned to build a small luxury spa where the old greenhouse is. I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I channeled it into pulling a particularly stubborn patch of thistle, yanking it from the earth with satisfying violence. Chloe was insufferable. Her campaign was in full swing, funded by promises of the impending sale. Her face was on posters stapled to telephone poles all over town. Chloe Vance, a fresh voice for a better city. She would stroll through the gardens with her campaign manager, pointing out features. "We can host a donor reception here by the fountain," she'd say, as if she were already a visiting dignitary. "It has such a lovely rustic charm." She never once looked at me, the person who created that charm with aching muscles and calloused hands. They saw my silence as grief, my hard work as a pathetic attempt to cling to the past. It was the perfect cover. Meanwhile, Mr. Albright was working diligently in the background. Every few days, a discreet plain envelope would arrive for me at the local post office box I'd rented. Inside would be updates. He'd located John Peterson, my father's fishing buddy, in Florida. The man was retired, sharp as a tack, and furious when he heard what was happening. He remembered signing the document in my father's study vividly. He was ready to testify. Mr. Albright had also subpoenaed a decade's worth of financial records from the estate's accounts. The preliminary numbers were staggering. They had burned through millions. Lavish vacations, luxury cars, designer clothes, and consulting fees paid to shell companies owned by Roger. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was systematic plunder. The first move on our chessboard was a subtle one. The sale was proceeding, with a closing date set for the end of the month. Roger and Helen had already started spending the money, placing a hefty, non-refundable deposit on a sleek new penthouse downtown, and making a massive headline-grabbing donation to Chloe's campaign. This was the moment Mr. Albright had been waiting for. He didn't send a bombshell, he sent a single, sterile-looking letter to their lawyer, a man named Sterling who was known more for his expensive suits than his legal acumen. The letter was a masterpiece of understatement. It simply stated that his office, on behalf of an interested party, was reviewing the historical administration of the Gable estate and had uncovered a potential testamentary discrepancy that might impact the chain of title. It requested a brief pause in the closing process pending clarification. It was vague, professional, and utterly terrifying. The call from Sterling to Roger must have been frantic. I was in the vegetable patch, staking up tomato plants, when Roger came storming out of the house, his cell phone pressed to his ear. "What do you mean, a discrepancies?" he yelled into the phone. "What interested party? It's a straightforward spousal inheritance. There are no other parties." He was pacing back and forth on the flagstone patio, his face turning a blotchy red. Helen came rushing out. "What is it, darling? What's wrong?" "Sterling says some old lawyer is questioning the will. He's holding up the closing," Roger snarled, finally hanging up the phone. His eyes scanned the property, a wild, paranoid look on his face, and then they landed on me. He strode over to me, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft soil. "You," he spat. "What did you do?" I looked up at him, wiping a smear of dirt from my cheek with the back of my glove. I widened my eyes, affecting the perfect picture of confused innocence. "What are you talking about, Roger? Don't play dumb with me, Alice," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've been moping around here for weeks. Did you go crying to someone? Did you try to contest the will?" I let a little tremor enter my voice. "Contest the will? I wouldn't know how. I don't have any money for a lawyer. I'm just the gardener, remember?" My use of their own words, their own dismissal of me, seemed to throw him off. It was too perfect. I was too pathetic to be a threat. He stared at me, searching for a sign of deception, but found only the bewildered, downtrodden girl he'd created. He let out a frustrated grunt. "Useless," he muttered, turning on his heel and stomping back to the house. But the seed of panic had been planted. Later that night, I heard them in my room. I was downstairs, reading in the kitchen, when I heard the floorboards creak above me. They were searching my attic sanctuary, rummaging through my meager belongings, looking for something. They didn't know what they were looking for, which made their search all the more frantic. A letter from a lawyer, a diary. I heard a box of my father's old paperbacks being overturned. I just sat there, sipping my tea, a small, cold smile on my face. They could tear my room apart. The truth wasn't in my room. It was in the land itself, waiting. The buyer's legal team, a cautious and thorough bunch, immediately put the brakes on the sale. The potential discrepancy was a red flag they couldn't ignore. The closing was postponed indefinitely. This is when the real panic set in for Roger and Helen. The penthouse deposit was at risk. Chloe's campaign manager was calling, asking why the pledged funds hadn't materialized. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life was beginning to crack, and their paranoia, now a raging fire, turned fully on me. They couldn't prove I had done anything, but they couldn't shake the suspicion either. I was the only unknown variable, the only person who had a reason to be unhappy. My quiet presence, once a comfort to them, was now a constant, unnerving accusation. Their confidence began to crumble, and in its place, a desperate, clumsy campaign of manipulation began. The dynamic of our little family was shifting, the gravitational pull of power moving away from them and towards my silent, watchful center. The movers were already booked, boxes were already packed. They had emotionally and logistically checked out of the manor, so certain of their victory that the thought of staying was now an impossibility for them. Their desperation made them sloppy. First came the love bombing, Helen's specialty. One afternoon, as I was pruning the wisteria that climbed the west wall of the house, she appeared with a tray. It held a china teapot, 2 delicate cups, and a plate of macarons. In 10 years, she had never once brought me so much as a glass of water while I worked. "Alice, darling," she cooed, setting the tray down on a stone bench. "I thought you might like a break. We never talk anymore." I stripped off my gloves and sat down, my posture wary. I poured the tea, my hands steady. "I know this whole sale has been hard on you," she began, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "It's hard on all of us. Saying goodbye is never easy." She placed her hand over mine. Her skin was soft and cool, her nails perfectly manicured. "But you must understand, it's for the family. Chloe's future is so bright, and we have to support her. Your father, he would have wanted that. He would have wanted us all to stick together and support each other." I met her gaze. "He would have?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Of course, darling," she said, squeezing my hand. "So if there's been some misunderstanding, with a lawyer or something, you can tell me. We're a family, we can sort anything out, just the 3 of us. You wouldn't want to do anything to hurt your sister's chances, would you? It would be so selfish." There it was. The guilt, the appeal to a family unity that had never existed. The subtle threat. I pulled my hand away gently. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mother," I said, taking a sip of tea. "It's good tea." Her smile tightened. My calm refusal to take the bait was not part of her script. She had expected tears, a confession, something she could manage. My placid demeanor was like a wall she couldn't find a foothold on. The conversation ended quickly. After that, Roger tried a different tactic a few days later: intimidation. He cornered me in the large, humid greenhouse, the one they planned to tear down for a spa. The air was thick with the smell of orchids and damp soil. He blocked the doorway, his large frame casting a long shadow over the seedlings. "All right, Alice, I've had enough of the games," he said, his voice a low growl. I don't know what you did, who you talked to, but this legal mess has your name written all over it. The buyers are threatening to pull out. Chloe's campaign is on the verge of collapse. You are going to fix it. I continued to meticulously mist a row of delicate ferns, my back mostly to him. Fix what, Roger? I'm just tending the plants. He took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. I am not your father. I don't have his patience for your little moods. You are going to call off whatever lawyer you hired, and you are going to sign whatever documents Sterling puts in front of you to make this go away. Do you understand me? I turned to face him then, holding the small brass water mister in my hand. I looked him directly in the eye, my expression unreadable. I didn't say a word. I just stared. I let the silence stretch, filling the humid air with a tension that was more powerful than any threat he could make. He was used to me flinching, looking away, stammering an apology. My silence was a language he didn't speak, and it terrified him. He was the one who broke eye contact first, sputtering something about me being an ungrateful brat before turning and storming out of the greenhouse, slamming the door behind him. The power had shifted. I felt it in my bones. They had lost control of the narrative, and they knew it. Their world was shrinking, constricting around them, while mine, for the first time, felt like it was expanding, full of possibility. Chloe, for her part, tried the one tool she had in her arsenal, condescending pity. She found me by the pond, feeding the koi my father had imported from Japan. Alice, she said, her voice full of a dramatic sigh, I know you're upset, but you have to think bigger. My campaign is about helping thousands of people. This one house, this one garden, it's a small price to pay for the greater good, don't you think? The greater good, I repeated, tossing another pinch of food into the water. The colorful fish swarmed, their mouths opening and closing silently. Or your good, Chloe. She recoiled as if I'd slapped her. How can you be so selfish? She gasped. After everything Mom and Dad have done for you, it was the final perfect encapsulation of their worldview. In their minds, allowing me to live as a servant in my own home was an act of profound generosity for which I should be eternally grateful. The sheer breathtaking delusion of it all was almost beautiful in its purity. I didn't bother to answer her. I just continued to feed the fish, the silent, hungry inhabitants of my kingdom. The end came, as I knew it would, with a demand for a meeting. Their lawyer, Sterling, insisted on it. The buyers had issued an ultimatum: resolve the title issue within 48 hours, or they were walking away and suing for breach of contract. The meeting was to be held in the grand living room of the manor, the one I was never truly welcome in. They were staging it on their home turf, a last-ditch effort to reassert their dominance. They expected to intimidate me, to surround me, to force me to sign away my rights, with a combination of legal jargon from Sterling and emotional manipulation from Helen. They thought it would be 4 of them against one little gardener. They were wrong. It would be 2 of them against the weight of a decade of lies. The day of the confrontation was bright and clear. The moving truck was scheduled to arrive the next morning. Boxes were stacked in the hallways, labeled Penthouse. It was a scene of frantic, premature departure. I took my time getting ready. I showered, washing away the last of the garden soil from under my nails. I bypassed my usual worn jeans and t-shirts. Instead, I chose a simple, elegant navy blue dress that had been my father's favorite. It was a dress of quiet confidence. I put my hair up, and for the first time in a long time, I looked in the mirror and saw not the gardener, not the mousy stepdaughter, but Alice Gable, daughter of Arthur Gable. I walked downstairs just as Mr. Albright arrived. He gave me a reassuring nod, his briefcase in his hand. He looked like a David, ready to face a whole family of Goliaths. We walked into the living room together. Roger, Helen, Chloe, and their lawyer, Sterling, were arranged on the cold leather sofas. They looked like a tribunal. Roger looked angry, Helen looked anxious, and Chloe looked bored and annoyed, as if this whole affair was a tedious distraction from her important work. Sterling, a man who looked like he was made of starched collars and ambition, stood and gave a curt nod. Alice, he began, foregoing any pleasantries. Thank you for coming. We need to clear up this unfortunate business with the estate title. I have a document here for you to sign, a quitclaim deed, that will relinquish any and all future claims you might have, and allow the sale to proceed. He slid a piece of paper across the glass coffee table. I didn't even look at it. I looked at my mother. A quitclaim? I asked, my voice calm and even. Why would I sign that? Helen leaned forward, her face a mask of pained sincerity. Darling, it's just a formality, to satisfy the buyers. Please, don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be. This was my cue. I turned to my companion. Mr. Albright, I said. Perhaps you should handle this. Roger's eyes widened slightly as he took in Mr. Albright, really seeing him for the first time. A flicker of recognition, and then confusion. Albright. What are you doing here? Mr. Albright smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. I'm here representing the legal owner of this property, Roger. My client, Miss Alice Gable. A stunned silence fell over the room. Sterling scoffed. That's absurd. The will is perfectly clear. Helen Gable is the executrix and beneficiary. Ah yes, the will, Mr. Albright said, opening his briefcase. The will you presented to the court, a fine document, simple, straightforward. It has only one problem. It was rendered null and void 2 months before Arthur Gable's death. He pulled out a plastic-sleeved document. It was a certified copy of the ledger page. He laid it on the table next to Sterling's quitclaim deed. This, he announced, is a legally notarized and witnessed codicil to Arthur's will. I believe you'll find it quite clear. It grants the entirety of the Blackwood Manor property, the land, the house, and I quote, all its living assets directly to his daughter Alice. Sterling snatched the paper and began to read, his face paling with every word. Helen just stared, her mouth slightly agape. Chloe looked from the paper to me, a dawning horror on her face. It was Roger who found his voice first, a strangled laugh. That's ridiculous. A note in some old book? That's not legal. On the contrary, Mr. Albright said cheerfully. It has been verified by the notary and both living witnesses. It is as ironclad as the day it was written. This house, this land you are standing on, the very air you are breathing, has belonged to my client for the past 10 years. He wasn't finished. He pulled out another file, a thick one, and dropped it on the table with a heavy thud. This, however, is the more pressing issue. This is a preliminary accounting of the estate funds you have been managing as executors. Over $10 million of income generated by the estate's investments, and nearly all of it spent on cars, on vacations, on a certain political campaign. He looked directly at Roger and Helen. This is called breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of funds, and embezzlement. The sale of this house, which you do not own, would be fraud. We are filing a petition with the court not only to affirm Alice's ownership, but to have you repay every single dollar you have stolen from her. The room was utterly silent, save for the sound of Sterling's ragged breathing. The color had drained completely from his face. He knew. He was a witness to their impending doom. Helen finally broke, her voice a high-pitched wail. But, Chloe's campaign, the donors, we made promises. Chloe just stared at me, the mask of a noble public servant shattering to reveal the terrified, entitled child beneath. You can't, she whispered. You'll ruin me. I had been silent through all of this, letting the beautiful, terrible truth settle over them. But now I spoke. I looked directly at Roger, at my mother, at the girl who had trampled my father's flowers. You offered me a job, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the still air, as the gardener for the new owners. I've thought about it, and I have to decline the position. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. However, I continued, a slow smile spreading across my face. The position of gardener for the current owner is open. The pay isn't great, just a small allowance really, but it comes with accommodations. You get to stay on the property, for a while. The look on their faces, the shock, the fury, the dawning horrific understanding that their entire world had just been swept away by the quiet girl they had relegated to the dirt, was more satisfying than a decade of apologies could ever have been. The charade was over. They weren't the lords of the manor anymore. They were just trespassers. The aftermath was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, swift collapse. The movers were of course cancelled. Their lawyer Sterling, after a very brief, pale-faced conversation with Mr. Albright, advised them to vacate the property immediately. He dropped them as clients 24 hours later. They did not take me up on my generous offer to become the new gardening staff. They left the next day. There was no grand exit, just a single leased SUV packed to the brim with designer clothes and whatever expensive trinkets they could fit. The penthouse they had put a deposit on was lost. The sports car Roger had bought in anticipation of the sale was repossessed. They left in a cloud of bitter, impotent rage, hurling insults at me as they drove away, their words snatched by the wind. Helen called me a monster. Roger called me a thief. Chloe just wept in the back seat. I watched them go from the front steps of my house, and I didn't feel a thing except a profound, bottomless sense of peace. The land was quiet again. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves a political candidate. Chloe's campaign imploded spectacularly. The story of the fraudulent funding, leaked by a disgruntled former campaign manager, became a local scandal. The fresh voice for a better city was exposed as a spoiled child living off stolen money. Her political career was over before it began. Roger and Helen are now buried under a mountain of legal trouble. Mr. Albright's petition to the court was successful. They are legally obligated to repay the millions they squandered, a judgment that will follow them for the rest of their lives. I see them sometimes, from a distance. They live in a small, cramped apartment on the other side of town. Helen's designer clothes have been replaced by off-the-rack outfits. Roger drives a decade-old sedan. They have been brought down not by my anger, but by the simple, unavoidable gravity of their own choices. The life they built was a house of cards, and all it took was one quiet truth to blow it all down. As for me, I live at Blackwood Manor. It's my home now, in fact as well as in spirit. The cold, modern furniture is gone, replaced by my father's sturdy, comfortable old pieces that I found stored in the carriage house. The house breathes again. I've turned the greenhouse, the one they wanted to demolish, into a thriving business. I cultivate and sell rare and heirloom plants, the kind my father loved. I host workshops, teaching people how to connect with the earth. The gardens have never looked more beautiful. Mr. Albright comes for tea on Thursdays, and we sit on the patio and talk about his cases and my new strain of climbing roses. He never lets me pay his invoices. He just says my father already settled the bill. They looked at the dirt on my hands and assumed it was a sign of my station, that I was beneath them. They never understood that the dirt, the land, the soil itself was the source of all my strength. It was my heritage and my future. They saw a gardener, but my father, my wise, wonderful father, always saw an heiress. He knew the land would remember who cared for it, and it did. It wasn't about revenge for me, not at first. It was about claiming what was rightfully mine, about honoring the faith my father had placed in me. It was about righting a terrible wrong, but I have to be honest with you, and with myself. Watching that SUV pull out of the driveway, shrinking in the distance until it was just a tiny speck of failure on the horizon, I felt a deep, profound, and undeniable satisfaction. Maybe it wasn't revenge, but it felt an awful lot like justice. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or taken for granted by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know you're not alone. Share your story in the comments below, if you feel comfortable. I promise you, I read every single one. Your stories matter, and if you found some small measure of satisfaction in mine, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know that you're out there, listening, and it encourages me to share more. Thank you for being here with me today.